Now then, so as we go into this last kind of part of the day, we are going to kind of experiment a little bit. One of the things that we were grappling with was recognizing that there was so much good content in all the breakout sessions, but that you could each only be in 2 of the sessions. And so how do we get that and share that sense of the discussion that was happening in the other sessions? So we've invented something that we've called an Optimism Barometer. And so what we've done is we've roped in a number of colleagues from some of our partner organizations and we asked them to sit in each of the sessions and act as a rapporteur. But rather than asking them just to sort of come back and do a sort of, well, in my session we said one thing, but on the other hand we said the other, we thought we'd kind of just give a sense of the optimism coming out, how they felt coming out of the session. And so we're going to do a kind of live visual representation of the level of optimism. So could I have the next slide, please? So here are our guinea pigs. Who are going to be experimenting with us to see if this actually works. So can I ask you all to come up? We've got Francesca Garcia, who is in the ethics and tech for good debate. We've got Josh Cowles, who is in the accountability and explainability. We've got John Zarelli, who's in fairness. John, do you want to just wave your hand? In the fairness and transparency. Imogen, who was in the session on inclusivity and diversity. And Millie, you were in the session on data privacy and governance. And Alexandra, you were in the session on public engagement and democracy. Just kind of realised how much stuff we covered today. So what I wanted to do was to see if this works, is to ask you, so on a sort of scale of feeling strongly disagree is on that side of the room, and feel free to go as far as you want in terms of however you felt. Strongly agree is on that side of the room, and again. But the key kind of question was, in each of your sessions, and I'm going to put these 2 things together, so you only have to move around once. But the question is, are we making practical progress? And do you think that we're on a trajectory to solve the problems that were set out in your sessions? So that's the question. So please go, wherever you want to, wherever you feel. So here we are, live barometer. Okay. So, well, this is interesting. So there is a balance towards optimism. So I think that is kind of quite interesting. And a couple on the more negative side. Now, just one last question, which is about the next part, which is in terms of what we needed to know. Was there a sense in your session that there is clarity about what we need to do next, what we need to do in the year ahead, or not? Did you feel confident that we know what we need to do? Now you can feel free to move. That's interesting. Very, very interesting. Right, okay, so let's just, we've got about 15 minutes, so let's try and get into some of the detail then. And let's go to the extremes. Imogen, let's start with you. The least positive feeling person out of your sessions. Take us through, sorry, I should have given you these mics as well, actually. Take us through kind of what it was that was making you feel less positive.
No? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, great. So our session started with the quote, "The future is here, it's just unevenly distributed," which I'm sure many of you have heard a few times already. That was a decade ago now, and really, I think what came out of the session was that not enough has changed in that last decade. There are new things we're concerned about when it comes to inclusivity, to diverse, to tackling inequality with some of these tools. And I think the conversation centered around, there were some really good examples at the micro level, right? There were companies doing great things, there were products which tried to do great things, there were tools which were trying to tackle this. But there's just been nowhere near enough progress at a macro level. And there's a few things we need to pick out, right? One is that offline society is not in a good shape when it comes to being inclusive and being diverse, and tackling inequality and tackling discrimination. Digital and data can magnify those issues. It's an issue that's come up a lot, and it also can create a new barrier to participation. And then compounding all of that, you've got this point that the people that have power to shape what the digital society is, and therefore what society is, they're often not the most inclusive group of people. They're often not the most diverse group of people. So how can we unpick that, and how can we start to make the changes that we need? And I think there was definitely, I don't want to sound really pessimistic because I'm an optimistic person, and there were some terms that everyone's coalescing around, good ideas to do with recruitment, to do with usability, but some of this stuff is around operationalizing empathy and around culture change, and it needs to be mainstreamed, it needs to be normalized, it can't just be a CSR exercise. So I suppose the reason that I'm in a slightly pessimistic place is partly just the very nature of the challenge of what we're talking about. There's no quick fix. It's not just going to be a tech solution. It's not a silver bullet. We're really talking about what capitalism we want, and also what society we want, and that's not easy to tackle. So hopeful that things are going to improve, but I think it's just, this is a really important area that everyone in this room is already thinking about how are we building the society that we want, and are we doing enough to make sure it is inclusive and it is diverse.
Okay, so a very long-standing problem, long-standing issue, and a sense that more being talked about, but in terms of actual progress, it's really hard to kind of pinpoint the other progress. Millie, I wanted to come to you, and so Sue's got the microphone there. So, I mean, another long-standing issue is data and privacy. We've long had data protection law. Again, an area where you think we know what needs to be done. So you were less positive on how things were, whether we're making practical progress at the moment, but you did feel we know what we need to do. So take us through that a little bit.
Yeah, so one reason I was so positive about we know what we need to do next is it was observed in our session that scandals like the Cambridge Analytica scandal have been fantastic for galvanizing public and political engagement and support and progress in this area. And I think when you can look at bad news like that, and these terrible things happen and they help actually drive positive change, then that means that the future can only get better. Another really good, but this is, I mean, it's really helpful.
A true optimist speaking, it's that.
It was very much the tone of the discussion that these things are useful for kind of alerting the public and politicians to what can go wrong and making sure that accountability and standards are raised. So that's a really positive way of kind of viewing the next steps. There was also a lot of agreement that what we need to do next is test things and think holistically. So another really nice image that was used in our session was of an iceberg. And the tip of the iceberg, the stuff above the waterline, we're calling it ethics, we're calling it privacy and so on, but actually you need to think holistically, and what's happening below the waterline is the pervasiveness of data, and that's how we need to think. So again, that's, that was a really kind of clear vision and future direction. And the only way you kind of find out what's below the waterline is by testing and innovating. So we know that's what needs to happen. The reason I was less optimistic about making practical progress and so on is, well, we've got the legislation that we've got. We've got the GDPR, we've got things like human rights legislation, we've got discrimination law and so on. Those are the tools we have. Someone called the GDPR the ghost of data protection, the ghost of Christmas data protection pass. So there's Dickens in our session too. And there's a sense that these are all legislations that were devised for a different time, for the generation before ours, but the fact is they're what we've got to work with them now, and that's part of the testing. You work with what you've got, you try to make it work, and you see where there are gaps, you then think holistically and not just above the waterline.
Brilliant. So we know what we need to do, we just need to kind of get on with it. And
take risks, and then I guess see the kind of fallout of risks as more positive public and political engagement.
Okay. Josh, let's come to you. So you're equally on sort of nearer on the optimism scale. Take us through. You were focusing in on the questions around accountability and explainability, and whether we can deliver that and achieve that.
Yeah, and I do think it was a fairly optimistic session overall. As you say, we had the accountability and explainability panel, and one of the reasons I was quite optimistic is that we were able to slay a few myths about these subjects, in particular the tendency to talk about these terms in opposition, accountability versus explainability. And that myth was slayed pretty early on by Richard's provocation, where he made the very valuable point that in many cases this isn't actually a direct relationship or inverse relationship between the two. And actually sometimes the more accurate systems are also the more interpretable. But even when they're not, crucially, this is a decision that we have to take. It's not just we need to prioritize accuracy above all else, but actually sometimes interpretability is going to be really important. And that was supplemented by the other speakers. Helena Quinn from the ICO pointed out this fantastic guidance, which I have to admit I have a vested interest in myself being at the Turing, on this Project Explain, which is this attempt to create guidance for different organizations looking to use AI around how to make it more explainable. So in terms of the trajectory, we have a consultation open for that, which I think is really positive. And I think we do have a good sense of momentum moving from this kind of idea that all AI is a black box and therefore we just need to trust it and panic only when things go wrong, to being much more anticipatory and thoughtful and contemplative about what these systems involve and actually make empowered decisions about whether or not we should use them and then how. So overall, yeah, pretty positive.
Very good. John, you're not quite on the fence, but you are on the stage. Fairness and transparency was your particular area. Tell us about how the mood in that session.
I think the mood overall is probably neutral, which is why I'm on the stage. I've chosen to be slightly towards the more optimistic end of the neutral region, but nonetheless, I'm still squarely neutral. And the reason for that is that I came away with the impression that the field of fairness and transparency is, if I could use the word, somewhat recalcitrant. It's very, very difficult to get a grip on what these terms mean in the real world, because carried over into this particular domain of AI ethics is the slipperiness of ordinary English language usage. And in ordinary English language usage, the word transparent means lots of different things. It can refer to, the transparency of a material, all the way through to something like holding someone accountable for their actions, for their misdeeds. There's a tremendous, amazing sort of variety in application of the term. And so when it comes to regulation of AI systems as they're being used, the idea of narrowing in on the target, knowing exactly what it is that we're looking at, what it is that we have to regulate. You've got competing notions of fairness and transparency themselves. There's sort of like due process notions of fairness. Then there are, as was mentioned in the session, there are outcome-based understandings of it. Just like in the equality literature, you have equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. So there are all these differences. And then there are many different areas of application. So in labour market sort of reform, in policing, in engineering, in insurance, all these questions come up in subtly different ways. So my general impression of where we've come is generally neutral, because I don't think we're much clearer on what needs to be done. And I think that's probably about where
Okay, but I think it's interesting, that one, in terms of the where it gets difficult to translate the concepts into action, and I mean, it's interesting actually, because even in running the sessions, we were trying to think, well, what's the difference between these sessions, and you do really get that sense of whilst at an ethical framework level, the ethicists may well be capable of defining these things, but when you're getting it into the lay level, it's kind of harder to do that. Francesca, the ethics in tech for good. So glad to see you're on the positive side of tech for good.
Yeah, I certainly was. So especially in terms of the progress that we've made, I was stood all the way over there, because I think this is kind of an area of AI that we should be really excited about. There are currently products on the market which are helping a lot of people and are kind of for a specific cause, helping accessibility, mobility, kind of access to different goods and services which were previously not possible. So I think it's evidence in the fact that they're available now, so that's clear kind of progress, which is great. I think in terms of where we need to go next, again, I'm still positive, but I think it was perhaps slightly less clear. I think there are some general kind of strong ideas about the kinds of things that we need to think about. But of course, I think there are kind of similar questions in terms of the implementation and collective action problems in this. So I just want to share a few snippets of kind of comments that were raised throughout the panel discussion. One of the questions that was provoked was whether the ethical risks associated to AI are inherent to it, in the same way that, for example, health risks are inherent to smoking. I thought that was quite an interesting question. There was also a big discussion around corporate governance structures and what would be the most advantageous to companies, employees, and society. And I think we're kind of excited about where this could potentially go. We might have kind of a revolution in our thinking around this, and associated with that, really who owns what. I think there was a big push to having a more interdisciplinary approach with lots of different teams collaborating from the inception in the development of a product, whether that be from an ethical, sustainability, DevOps perspective, all collaborating together. So I think there's a lot of potential, and yeah, I'm still very optimistic about the session. All in all.
Thank you very much. Alex, public engagement and democracy. Well, we're a day away from an election. Democracy is
thank you for this one.
A little bit ropey. But take us through how you felt about your session.
So we initially started talking about how accessible even digital ethics as a concept or a term is to the wider public. Even us today in our different sessions have been trying to figure it out and talk about it. So kind of trying to discuss and disseminate that and engage the public around it. How good a job are we doing? And how difficult a job is it going to be? There was some really nice examples around, or small examples around citizen engagement, including looking at citizens juries and implementing sets of processes that can have significant impact on policy. Bringing a smaller number of people together isn't always necessarily the best way of reflecting back into society. So the idea of being able to create thoughtful spaces of deliberation with a wider audience. Nice example of training up community facilitators to engage with community groups over, for example, the course of a year. And beginning to set up community networks to help join the dots and create a sustained network of deliberation and public reflection and engagement. We also forget, this was a point that was brought up, that the public are already talking about lots of these issues. They might be using different language. They might be talking about it in a different way to the way we are. But rather than engaging with the public in that wider way, things maybe have been done in a more clinical way, in the way we conduct user research. So we can do great work with the public, but will policymakers actually listen? That's another really important point that was brought up. So policymakers may struggle with the idea of accepting what the public has said unless they feel it's fully robust and maybe the answers chime with what their own bias already suggests. And I think one of the really important points is the government needs to trust the public. So if meaningful questions are asked by the government, then the expectation of meaningful answers will come out of that discussion as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So there you have our kind of living barometer of the kind of the mood in the room. Kind of a last question for you, the audience, really is in terms of your experience of the day so far. If this feels like an appropriate sort of measure of the mood of the event, please raise your hand. Do you think this feels about right? Oh, okay. And if it doesn't, if it feels very different to your reading of events today, a couple, but definitely a minority. Well, there you go. I'm not sure what that really tells us anyway, but it's been fun. Thank you very much to my assistants for their excellent work and the rapporteurs, and thank you all.